reasons, but mainly because in technology, many times we just think about the technical roles that go into a lot of what composes an organization. And it's important sometimes to see what other roles are out there that are not necessarily technical. So when I started talking to some of the team members, the organizers that created this wonderful event, one of the things that came up in there was, okay, what else can I add of value that is not necessarily going to be super technical? And my focus has been in technology for almost 8 years now. And I am more focused on the operation, on the customer facing side, but that doesn't mean that I don't interact or I am highly dependent on the other departments that are there. So for me, it has always been a collaboration. Also, I'm excited to be here because sometimes we don't see a lot of leadership, ladies in technology. So we're trying to grow that at our organization, every other organization, because I think it's very important to have that diversity and representation across the board. So without further ado, let me get to the next slide. All right. So a little bit about me. My name is Karla Kannan. I'm the Senior Vice President of Customer Success at BirchStreet Systems. I am basically responsible for the relationship and prioritization of our customer accounts, looking at their goals across the portfolios and the different verticals that we have. I also manage the knowledge management team. That's an initiative we have on the organization, and also the e-learning side. My experience has come from being project manager, managing the program team, and now customer success. And throughout my career, I will tell you that data has been such an important component of everything we do. And it has not just been a side or a secondary thought. It drives everything that we do and how we work with our customers, which is why I'm so passionate about the topic I'm going to present to you today, because you will see how a lot of the work that many of you do translates into how we work with our customers. And just to level set for this conversation, I am going to use customers interchangeably. Sometimes I'm going to refer to customers as actual customers, meaning the end user or the end individual using your product or service. But I will also want you to think about users. Sometimes it will be your internal stakeholders, because we do have our internal customers. So if you never interact with a customer, that doesn't mean that this doesn't apply to you, because your contributions play a huge role into that. And if you are working on internal initiatives, projects, or different products internally, that will be just for internal use. Those are your customers. So just know I'm not referring just to customers as the person that signed a contract for a product or service with your company. I am also referring to those that you service internally as your stakeholders. I'm super excited here. I do a lot of metrics. I am Six Sigma Green Belt certified. And one of the reasons why I pursue that was because of data. Like, how could I analyze the data? How could I measure the waste that we had in some of the processes? And there's always going to be waste. The idea is to minimize that and to create those efficiencies that are required. Customers want that, organizations want it. So all along, it plays a huge role. So the first thing we have to think about is, how do we define value? Defining value is very interesting, because somebody might find something valuable and it can be very subjective. So when we think about value, we have to think about how it differentiates us. The differentiator is, how do we recognize the challenges experienced by our organization or our customers? So it might be the value of innovating to solve unmet needs, to improve a process, to automate, to introduce new tools, to attract a new audience, or to predict the future. And I don't mean that with you're trying to look at that ball and see what is going to happen. I'm trying to talk about predictors that the data is going to give you. It could also be prediction based, talking about that, taking into account the potential revenue against funding. In technology, we use this a lot, but even in my previous life, when I was in supply chain, in hospitality, I use data all the time to predict how the organization will behave in a future standpoint, looking at what historically had happened. For example, what was the historical occupancy of the hotel? Based on that, what were the purchases that will go through the system of record that we had, which at that point was a procure-to-pay solution. And then I could forecast what would be the requirements for our purchases for the following year. And there's so many factors that go into that. So definitely I've been very involved into doing forecasting, prediction-based, value-driven decisions, because when we do budgeting, whether it's for your internal departments or external departments, we have to use the data. We have to think about how that will affect the funding that we have. We're given a budget. Now we have to think about what we did last year, where are we going in the future, and how we're going to track that. And our customers do exactly the same thing. This cycle that they do budgeting is exactly the same predictors that they need, except that they're going to use the data that you give them to prove that value that your product or service is given them, to in return translate that into either making additions, purchasing more, or just continue with your products or services. So it's very important that they have that information. Now, another thing that happens is the viewpoint. You have to always think about what is the viewpoint of the customer, whether it's internal or external, that is going to take that data. So if you prepare the value for what is just perceived for that particular team or for your organization, and you don't take into account what that customer, be external or internal, what the customer perceives of value, you're going to have a clash. Just because it's important for you or for your department, that doesn't mean that that becomes valuable to others. So always think that when you are working with metrics, they have to be the value of the recipient from that standpoint. And then ROI driven, this is so critical, right? It has to follow established framework. When we think about the return of our investment, we always have to think about how did we arrive at that. And I will tell you that for us in customer success, one key thing that we have to think about is how did we sell or position the product or service that we put forward in front of a customer, and then how we are going to prove that value. Because one thing is me sitting here and say, well, you're going to save X amount, or you're going to have, an increase in efficiencies of X, Y, or Z. But if at the end of the day, I can't just present that, I can't document it, I can't explain it, I can't give anything to the customer, and therefore I have not realized the ROI. So some of the things that you can think about is like, what is the time saved? What are the resources that are saved? Especially now post-pandemic, a lot of customers have already had a reduction in their workforce. And this happens with every time that you have a recession or you have a big change. Organizations will think about how nimble they can be. And in thinking how nimble they can be, that always reducing labor costs or the shifting of those roles to create automation. And when you do that, the first thing customers will look is, can we do this faster with less? To arrive at that decision, they have to select what are those metrics that they are going to grab and what is going to be the baseline to measure against. So people, for example, in sales are going to paint a benefit to the customer in terms of savings, time, or convenience. I can tell you that when I was in project and program management, sometimes that value that was presented at the beginning was very difficult to continue, because if as an organization you cannot meet that, but you use it on the sales cycle, then you are trapped because your customer knows that something was committed to them. So all of these things are translated into dollars. For example, if you told the customer that the savings will be estimated $6 million a year, each month that something gets delayed, let's say my project was supposed to go live in 6 to 8 months, and I get it delayed, each month of delay will cost me $500,000. You see how substantial that is? And that's why it is important to have the baseline to understand what is going to be the return on investment, and make sure that when we set those expectations with the individuals that are going to be through the project, that is going to be a realistic expectation. So with that, I'm going to move to some use cases that we have on how we prove value. And this slide I put together because I wanted to explain it, again, not just in terms of customers, but to show you some use cases across the organization. For example, in IT and DevOps, you will use help desk call volume as a metric, or the resolution time, resource allocation, uptime, and system availability. In the contracts that we write with customers, they will be very specific about some service level agreements. And within those service level agreements, you're going to have uptime and system availability as a key metric. If you're in software, this is so important. You can just say, well, the system will be available X percentage of time and not meet it. Penalties will be carried if you don't meet an SLA. But further than that, if you don't measure how often your application has to be, working or the system is available, then you don't know how you're performing. So when I talk about IT DevOps or any of these metrics, they're external and internal because your organization has to measure how they're doing as well as how your customers perceive that. So for us, when I talk about the organization I work with, is for us to measure how we're doing internally, but then in return, our contracts will have metrics related to uptime and system availability. So we measure it to figure out what is the health of internal and external metrics. Now, finance, budget planning. I mentioned previously the budget that the organization will plan, as well as the budget that you will use with your customers or the decisions that will lead them to add you into their budget planning. The worst thing you can do is wait until it's budget season for you to prove value. Value has to be a constant, but you keep that goal that the budget season will come. In hotels, which is the business that I work with, is September. So we know September is coming. So everything leading to September is going to be an indicator of whether or not the customer will renew. In your case, your cycles might be a little bit different, but keep that into mind. It also will be accounts payable. It could be expense reports. It could be accounts receivable. Those are some of the finance metrics that are use cases for getting that data. Marketing, campaign engagement. Are customers engaged with us? When we invest the time into putting a campaign together, are they actually and actively looking at it? Or they just go to their junk folder? You can measure that. For example, you have MailChimp, that will be one of the resources that they have, and you can do email campaigns and you can track against it. Very important that if you're going to invest time in an activity, you can prove that it added value. In HR, turnover rate, open recs, new hire retention, employee satisfaction, onboarding times. Every time you get an employment survey, which I hope most of you do, your organization trying to track how they're performing, that carries a value. And it doesn't stay just with HR. Sometimes it will stay at HR level. It translates into how your departments are rated, but overall, how as an organization you're performing with your the people component, and more importantly, for if you have a board, how they can view with data and no emotion how an organization is performing. In sales quote tracking, average deal size, if you're winning or losing rate. Sales is very metrics driven, but that's because they also have a big push. In sales, you're always looking against the comp. So if you want to receive, that commission, you have to prove that you achieve a goal. So when you set your goal at the beginning of the year, you are constantly measuring against it. And in my case, in customer success, we have leading indicators. What is a leading indicator? A churn rate, meaning, how many customers are leaving us? How many of them are churning? How many of them are staying with us? How many have the potential to churn? Customer satisfaction scores, very important. Are customers satisfied? And product activity coefficient, that is how your customers are using the product. Now I'm gonna take a pause here because I'm gonna tell you that a lot of people measure things just as a feeling. And in some sense, if you're talking to your customers via internal or external, sometimes you can say, well, how is such and such doing? And you say, that account is doing great. That's a feeling. It may or may not. Maybe for me it's doing great. Maybe for my colleague is, but maybe for the customer it's not. So when you have data, then you can actually assess how that customer or that account is performing. But when organizations are just driven by a feeling, and I'm not saying that it's not important because we have to have connections with those that we are working with, it's so important, but you cannot really measure it without having those data points. That's why I find these sessions that you guys are having super valuable, and I look forward to attending some of them, because for me, having this information has removed the emotional component of making decisions. So now that we walked over some use cases, let's talk about how we can define value metrics. So how do we define value metrics? There are two sets. They can be functional or they can be outcome-based. So when we think about them being functional, you can think about your product or service that you're representing, and it could be per user or per transaction. A lot of the times when we set pricing by being functional is set around usage. So think about it, how many licenses somebody's purchasing, how many active users. If I think about an LMS, for a learning management system, for them it will be how many active users you have in a given month. It could be how many users are logging. If you think about some of the software applications out there of software companies, think about Slack. Slack is measuring the value metric in the number of messages sent. But you could also be thinking about YouTube, how many views you get. Instagram, how many views your reel or your ad saw in there. So those are per user per transaction. Value metrics outperform the feature differentiation with up to 75% less churn, meaning it reduces that. Now, these metrics I got from Patrick Campbell, who is the CEO of Profitwell, so I do want to call it out. So this is how you do the functional value metrics. Now, the outcome-based metrics are a little bit different. These are going to be, for example, how many transactions or how much revenue is generated for a customer. Let's think about Venmo. That's a good example of outcome-based metrics. That will be the amount of revenue generated. So this is how you're dealing for transactions. In our case, we're a procure-to-pay solution. So we measure on the number of transactions or spend that is running through a platform. So it's an outcome that is expected by the organization or by your customer. Now, why is a value metric important? It's going to drive pricing, but it also has a business impact, and it has to be aligned with your customers. I remember how I told you before that if it's not aligned with your customers or is not what they perceive as value, it doesn't count. Exactly. This is where it is very important. Why do we use data versus metrics? Well, because you can pick a data point, but you cannot just pick the metric, meaning the metric will have one single data point, and that's what we're measuring. There's a lot of data out there, but we have to focus on what is relevant. So how do we do that? We have to think about three things. Is the metric easy to understand for the customer? So if I cannot explain it to whoever I determine to be the customer in this case, then it doesn't add value. So the first thing you need to ask when somebody tells you, well, we need data to measure X metric, how do I represent that so it is easy for someone to understand? Is the information relevant? One thing that we do, for example, in my case, our customers will come and say, hey, I need to understand what's the spend that's going through your system. That will be outcome-based. But if I just represent data out there from a customer that is global, it's going to make no sense if I put things in all sorts of currencies. So first I have to think about how do I normalize a currency and how I represent that in a way that proves the value that the customer expected to get out of the application. Or what kind of KPIs did I set with the customer at the beginning of engagement that I need to prove? The next one is it aligned with the perceived value that the customer is getting out of your product? If the customer is not aligned with what you define as value, is not going to succeed. We have to define success at the beginning, whether it's an internal project or an internal initiative, or you are working with customers, or you're being asked to produce data for a customer interaction. Make sure that you understand what was the perceived value that the customer had, and also what is success. Success will be successful if we go live with this project by X date. Is that really all that it takes? So if it goes horribly wrong, as long as we go live, it's successful? No. So make sure that you understand what is the perceived value and the measure of success for your customer. And does it grow with usage? For example, the more that somebody views your videos, then you will increase X retention by this, or your pricing model will change by that. So think about, if it's going to grow with usage, or if it is a static. I mean, you rarely will want a static metric unless it's, that you want to keep employee retention. What are some of these pricing strategies? And I'm bringing this because I don't know how exposed you are of how your organization does pricing strategy, but I think it's very important that you know that. And if you are curious, I'm sure if you ask, they will tell you. So here are how we do some pricing strategies. Cost plus, which is the cost plus the markup. You can also have competitive pricing, meaning what your competition is charging. When I was in hotels, we will do that. We will drive uh, that strategy based on what hotels were around us that were in the same space and how much they were charging. You want to be competitive for sure in anything that you do, but that doesn't mean that that's the sole driver of your pricing. So it could be cost plus, it could be competitive, it could also be value based. So what customers believe your product should be valued. If you ever watch Shark Tank, which I'm sure some of you have done that, when they go and present the company and say, I'm asking for 400,000 for 1% of my organization, you always see the face of people and they always say, well, why are you coming to that valuation? Because they're doing it based on what they believe it should be valued. And if you don't have the data or the metrics behind it, then the shark usually will go chomp chomp. And how do you go, right? So think about that. If you're going to use value based, it has to actually be substantiated. It's not just a feeling. Then it's price skimming. Price skimming is going to look at the evolution of the market. As it evolves, it will change. Think about, for example, real estate, right? That's how it fluctuates, is price skimming. And lastly, penetration. Penetration, you were going to start lower because you want to enter in the space. You have nothing to put against it, meaning you are just starting. And as you enter the market, you will start increasing it. So you might start with penetration pricing, and then your pricing strategy might change. So I'm bringing this because I think it's important that you understand how your organization is going to set some metrics based on whether it's functional or outcome based, and also what are some of the pricing strategies that they have behind it. So with that, I'm going to move now to how customers are using your metrics. And again, for those that join a little bit late, I'm using the term customer interchangeably. It could be your internal customers if you just work with your internal customers. I'm sure that translates into the overall strategy of your organization, and eventually it impacts your end users. But I'm also using customers when it is you actually providing information for the end user directly. So how do how do our customers purpose metrics? Well, they do it the following way. They look at productivity efficiencies. For example, the labor rate against the hours saved in a given task or process. And they're looking at things such as how much am I saving? How are you minimizing my rest? One easy way for us to prove that will be to take what will happen if your customer was not using your product or service. What on average will it cost to generate X transaction or do X process? And then based on that, compare it to what it takes to do it with your product or service. And the delta will be the savings. It puts a clear picture in front of the customer. I did this recently with one of our key partners, and they were asking, well, how is it costing me to create one transaction with your system? Had I just pinpoint the little tiny thing where it was like how long it takes to create a purchase order in my system, I will be remiss of the entire process that actually goes through our application. So instead of that, I thought, why don't I compare it end to end? And why don't I take that further and using some of the data points out there of average salaries, average time it takes, interviewing some people to get those numbers, I was able to put a comparison of, hey, how long does it take to create a purchase order end to end, and how long does it take with our system? And that translated into actual labor cost savings. And it's such a clear picture that it really, if you think about, okay, customer, I told you one, but you're going through X number of transactions every single month, it translates in X amounts of savings. That's a pretty telling picture. That's a fantastic metric that you can use in front of your customers. The next one is business intelligence. That's all out there. You probably all have sessions today about that. It's measuring before and after use cases to display differences. That's how we calculate it. It's very much used in inventory management, in product adoption rates. You're going to leverage analytics and or the data to understand how to make processes more efficient. When I was in supply chain, we used this a lot to understand how our inventory fluctuations would happen, how could we ensure that we could predict. And so, inventory, sometimes it has a shelf life. So you cannot just bring inventory, like it's the end of the world, because then if you don't put that against how your operation will flow or what are some of those business levels, then you are going to get stuck with a lot of inventory. Predictive intelligence, that's measuring before and after use cases as well, but to display the differences. But in here, think about reduced dead stock. So if you have a lot of items in there that are not moving, why are they not moving? Should we buy them again? We need to analyze, why things are just stagnant. I see that a lot in businesses that have huge inventories, and then they have a lot of dead stock and they don't know why it's there, but it's just perpetually there. You're like, well, that has not moved in ages. This is important for us to predict how things move, how they have moved, and use that difference to ensure that we can have that intelligence to make predictions in our business. And then the growth speed. When I think about growth speed, is measuring before and after use cases as well, but that are very customer specific. And this is what we align the KPIs, the key performance indicators that you set with your customer. So when you think about this, a lot of the decisions that we make on analytics and the history, they are a predictor for future behaviors. And volume-based depiction, it tells you what is the velocity of a solution. So that's how your customers are likely viewing at your metrics. I will tell you from my experience, they look a lot about efficiencies, especially now. Like, I was speaking just a few minutes ago about the post-pandemic world. In the post-pandemic world, this happens a lot. They're looking at how do we become more efficient? How do we take something that was taking X amount of time and cut it down to X amount? It happens in manufacturing. It's going to happen in healthcare. It happens everywhere. It's just that now it has become more obvious and people really want that automation. But just to say, I want to automate something, we have to think about which area are we going to hit. So in return, we can measure it. And remember, if you can measure it, you can control it. And that's why this is so important. All right, so I'm going to move along to how organizations are embedding metrics in operations. Here are some things that we do. We do benchmark exercises. Things that we do with that is comparing the usage and performance against competitors, yours or the ones from your customers. I use this a lot in my interactions with my key accounts. If I just go to them and say, this is how you are using our system, that's fantastic. But what if I take it a step forward and I said, hey, this is how your competitors are using the system against you. Of course, you can't disclose who is that customer, but what I do is I grab a subset of customers that are in the same space or in the same verticals, and then I use that to compare my customer. I don't disclose information. It will be customer A, B, C, and D, and I will show them how they're performing. Sometimes that story that these metrics are telling is very powerful because sometimes it shows them that they're performing really well. And I've had that, I go to the customer, I'm like, we're doing really, really great against your competition. But in some cases, they are not. And it also helps you drive the story for change. Why? Because if they're not using your products or services as intended and you start digging as to what, I take one metric, I look at it and say, okay, this customer, for example, has a lot of orders that are circumventing the system. Why is that happening? I don't just show the numbers. I have to tell the story behind it. So once I have all those metrics, I can start evaluating how that customer is behaving and what needs to happen. Maybe they have not received training in a long time and we need a refresher. Maybe some of the flows that we put in the system are not working because their organization has changed. Maybe users are not very tech savvy, or maybe it's because their internal business processes from when we give them a solution to where they're using it today has changed. So that's why those benchmark exercises for me are very, very critical. And you can use that, for many different things, but people like to know always how they stack against others. And that's why I like this exercise. The next one is a business review. You probably have heard of that at some point or another. Your organization might be doing a business review. Sometimes they're internal business reviews and sometimes they're with your customers. They're very powerful tools. If you don't use them correctly, they become sales pitches, and there's nothing more annoying for a customer where you just go and be like, hey, do you want to buy a watch? That's not what they want. So a business review is going to have an alignment on best practices that your organization will recommend. What is the best in class? But more than that is measuring how they are utilizing your products or services against what they contracted. Like I told you, the benchmark exercise shows that, but against their competitors. This is just about them. So in here, you can really drill down. For example, how many transactions you're creating in a given month, how many of those ones are circumvented the system, how much spent is going through the application. It depends on what organization you have, but it's very important that these business reviews are very strategic. They have to always keep in mind who is your audience and what are you trying to convey. And what you're trying to convey is always value. How am I of value to you? How do I prove that value? How are you partnering with us, be it your departments, your organization, or your organization with a customer? How are you partnering with us to make the best use of our products or services? And then a competitive analysis. We use this to stack products or services during an RFP cycle with data across your customer base. Customers will come to your organization and say, hey, how would you solve this problem I have compared to another? And so when they get the request for proposal or request for information, usually a huge packet, and it comes with a lot of information. If you just add fluffy things in there, they will come and hunt you because when they sign that contract, they're going to expect that you keep up with that. So that's why some of those metrics that you can generate internally within your organization, average average realization, average number of transactions, average spend savings. All of this information is so critical because you can use that to put a competitive analysis forward and then in return prove the value that your company will bring to a customer or to a organization. So important to have this. These to me are key. I use them quite a bit in my interactions. I will say more than ever. Most of my customers that have come back post-pandemic, they have come back and they have asked for a lot of data, and it becomes increasingly tricky. Now, one thing that happens is in the past, your customers will come, sign a contract, and that will be the end of that, and then you will just bill them. Now that they're so invested in understanding what value they're getting, if you don't have the ability to provide those metrics, it's almost as if getting them in, then trap their data, right? And you're like, yeah, you cannot have it. And customers like, why can I have it? You're like, because I cannot measure it. So every time that your organization puts product or service out there, the question should always come, okay, if we're going to do a new product release or a new service release or a new offering, let's not just consider the functionality or the service that we're going to put forward, but how are we going to be able to measure it? Because if you can't do that, you trap yourself and you trap your customer because you cannot prove value. So keep that in mind. So important. It's almost like having a bear trap, right? Gotcha. Now you can get out. Okay. Now I want to talk about health metrics in vendor scorecards. That is an internal metric, and these are internal scorecards. But health metrics can be subjective, can be that feeling of how are we doing. So here are some examples that we use in customer success when we think about some of the health metrics. So some of the ones that we have will be open cases. If you have a support system, Zendesk, ServiceNow, whatever it may be, open cases are very important. It tells you how healthy your organization is or how healthy your customer is. Why do we get so many support cases? Are they lagging against our service level agreement? What type of support cases do we have? I'm always very interested about what kind of support cases we have. Are they related to user errors? That tells me we need training or documentation or materials. Are they because it's a recurrent process that is not working as intended? Well, let's revise how it is working. Let's listen to what needs to be improved. Are they, coming to us because there's confusion? Okay, well, maybe we need to process flow it so they know how things should move in the application. So always think about open cases, not just as a reflection of support. Support is a tough department to work for, but they do have very specific metrics, but in return, you have to be able to interpret that data and figure out how that actually translates in how healthy your customer is. The next one is product. How many bugs and enhancements are out there? If your customer is full of bugs, something is not right. And it cannot just be reactive. Oh, how many bugs I have? Oh, nothing gets resolved. And then you just keep fighting with product or with development for it. We have to really understand, why are there so many bugs? And sometimes what I like to do is look at the bugs across accounts, because that's where I identify that there is a common theme. And having that data for me to go in front of my product team has been so important. Those metrics of, what is the number of bugs against, the health of my customer, that's an important metric. I can then go to product and say, hey, this keeps happening, and it's not just this account, it's this account, this account. These are the number of tickets that we see related to it, support cases. Now I have a full picture and I can make my case. Enhancements are the same. Every organization that allows for enhancements, which a lot of us do, it can get out of control very fast. And another thing that happens is your customers, when they put enhancements and enhancements and enhancements, they become wish list, and then they say, "You never do anything for me." Having the ability to measure your product metrics also tells the customer how much value you are giving them, sometimes billable or not billable. That is, having an effect or an impact on how they are using your product or service. So product metrics, super important as well, because they really have a end user impact, and it's faster to track them. Sometimes if it's a lot of bugs, how do you remediate? And if it's enhancements, why do we keep asking for enhancements? Can we solve what's something that is already there? There has to be a story about why a customer keeps asking for more and more. Maybe it was not a product fit. Sometimes customers, we can sign customers at different organizations that might not be a fit for your product. And if you constantly try to fit them in, that results in a lot of enhancements, and customizing your solution so much later on leads to a lot of support cases. Adoption, how well they're using your products or services. This one is particularly important because if they sign for something and then they're not using it, we have to understand why. What is driving it? And in many cases, you find that they got creative and have a solution, behind the scenes, or maybe they're transitioning to another provider. So measuring adoption is one of those metrics that you want to use constantly. For us, we set that as KPIs with our customers, and we'll say, okay, what do you want to measure? It might be the number of invoices coming through the system. It might be, how fast transactions are moving, how long it takes to approve. We look at those metrics that will tell us how that they are using the product or service, tells us the adoption, but in terms of the customer when we set those KPIs. And lastly, services. Have we delivered on time and with quality? Whether your CSM team or your project program professional services team is in charge of onboarding, your customers will want to know how long it will take for value realization. How long will it take me to put in use your product or service? If you have a phone, you just buy it and you start using it, that's enough. But if it has to go through an onboarding cycle, then there's going to be a metric. PMO, the project management office, will always track their KPIs around quality and time and budget. So they will look at, did we deliver on time against budget, and was it of quality? So for a customer success, we feed off of that information because it plays a huge part in how the account is transacting with us. For you, it could be how long it takes to do something also internally and not directly related to your customer. But if your services are not delivering on time with value and quality, that's already a challenge, because that means that how they adopt it, how they use it is going to be stagnant. And if you recall at the beginning of the presentation, I told you how much money that will cost you. That could, in a 6 million deal that gets delayed, it's $500,000 per month until you get your revenue. Because in most SaaS companies, you will charge an implementation cost. If you are in a subscription model, you will charge on the implementation cost, but then you don't get the subscription until they start using your product or service. So think about, it takes me so long to recognize that revenue that every month has a huge impact on how I get value from my customers. So hopefully this was representative for you. I know we are on time. I know I have 15 minutes for any questions you may have, but I do want to convey that at the end of the day, whether you're working with end users requesting those metrics or not, I can tell you that in my job, I rely so heavily on metrics and requesting the data. We work with our data management services team to get a lot of this information. But just receiving the data is not enough. I have to rationalize that, put it into metrics, and make the right representation for our customers. Sometimes it's putting it on Power BI, creating a dashboard. Sometimes it's creating, like portals that we do for our customers, whether it's on SharePoint, Smartsheet. It can be different avenues, but it has to make sense. So the data alone is not going to tell me the picture. I have to take that data, translate it into metrics that I've set with my customer that will be key performance indicators, and then represent those metrics for my customers so they understand the value. And that's really it. That's in a nutshell what we do. Of course, there's more complexity to that, but I think this is a good baseline for you to have. And I encourage you to ask questions to your organization if you don't know your pricing models, if you don't understand, how are they setting KPIs. I think that that's super valuable. So with that, if memory serves me right, Elvis, now we have time for questions.
That's correct.
All right. Well,
does anybody have any questions?
You don't necessarily need to say your question. You can put it in the chat and I'll be happy to read it. If you rather not speak, I'll be happy to just read the question if that makes you more comfortable. How to apply these principles in a startup. That is a challenge for sure, because in a startup, you don't really have a lot of data. You don't have a lot of history. But what you can do is you can survey the market, and see what are they using. At the end of the day, even if you're a startup and you don't have historical data, you can actually still set KPIs. You can set KPIs internally. If you don't do that at the beginning, it's very hard to get your organization down the line to want to adapt them. So what happens is everybody's so focused on the product or the service that they are offering, right? Usually you start very small, you have a small offering and you're chasing customers and you want to get this going. But guess what? Even if it's one customer, they're going to want to understand what is the ROI of what they have contracted. But you internally need to know how to measure it. So regardless of whether you are a standing company or you're a startup, you should set those KPIs with your customer from the beginning. And internally, you should make sure that you know in your department what are going to be the KPIs that you're going to be measured against. If you don't do that and you go through the entire process as established organization, trying to then retrofit KPIs, it's very difficult and people will fight it because then they think, why do you have to measure it? We all should have measurements. How do we know how we're doing otherwise? That's a great question. Thank you. Anyone else?
I am also posting the speaker evaluation link here on our chat. So if you guys can take a minute after the session and fill it out.
Thank you. We do have another question. We use ServiceNow where I work, and they're reporting on open tickets with counts and aging. Is there something more subjective that could be done along the lines of quality of fixes? You can. It is quite likely that your organization has service level agreements. So one thing that I would recommend is that when you look just on open cases or how they're aging, you also look at what is the time frame. For example, if you have a severity 1, for example, everybody is out or the solution is not working, people cannot get into the system, that will be a severity 1. If it is well defined what falls into each severity, most companies will do severity 1, 2, 3, 4. If you can outline what are some of the use cases that fall in there and your tickets are then stacked against severity, you have the SLAs, correct. So if you do that, then one thing that I like to do is separate them into not only if we resolve them on time, but also I like to separate them into which ones require actual effort from development. It is important to do that if your organization is going to have to do some code changes, because that takes additional time for resolution, as opposed if it's just a severity 3 and all you had to do was make a configuration change. So I like to do those SLAs, and I have to present SLAs in front of my customers. Every month we present them, and then we have to have a session about it. The first question they do is, why do we have so many in this space? So I like to represent it the following way. I like to represent by severity, the number of open cases, the number of closed cases, which ones met the SLA in percentage. So out of 500 tickets, that were in severity 3, how many met the SLA, and then out of the overall, what is the percentage of tickets that were outside of the SLA? Because usually they carry penalties, and I want to be super clear about where do they fall and not just look at it as like, oh, this many fell into SLA and this many not. No, let's take a whole story. Why? Let me give you an example. Let's say that a severity 1 ticket was not resolved within the SLA, so you get a 0%. But if you just put 0% on the SLA met, the customer doesn't understand that it was just 1 ticket. I mean, still you didn't meet it. Don't get me wrong. They're still going to say why you didn't meet this ticket SLA. But it's different to say I have 500 tickets in severity 1 that met the 0% SLA. See, that is the difference. So that's why I like to put the representation not only in the percentage of SLA met, but I also like to put the number of cases and the overall percentage that is not missing the SLAs. I encourage also that those are reviewed internally before you meet with your customer to avoid surprises during the meetings. So hopefully I answered that question. Any other questions out there? Absolutely, absolutely. How about I put some of the resources, I'll put them on the chat of the Flux Capacitator chat, and you can look into them because there is so much out there when it comes to data and a lot of good reading. I can put some in there that will be helpful. So, I'll put them in the chat and you can look after the session. I'd be very happy to share them. All right, let's take one more question. Because I don't want to be late for the next presenter and go into their session. All right, looks like no more questions. Well, listen, if you think of anything, feel free to reach out. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, Karla Kannan. You can find me right there. If you go take a look, we're happy to connect. If you have any questions, if you are brainstorming with your organization, hey, I'm not sure how to prove value, connect with me. I'll be happy to lend you a hand.